Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us for our online open house session for number 5 Lower Union Street. My name is Mark Nerdy. I'm with the city's communications department, and I'm going to be helping to facilitate this online session. We currently have about 25 attendees joining us, so we're going to go ahead and get things started now. Next slide, please. So again, welcome to the 5 Lower Union Street open house. This is a consultant-led open house and is not a statutory public meeting. It's going to be conducted by project consultants using our city Zoom platform. So while city staff will be able to help run the session behind the scenes, this will be consultant-led. Today's session is live streamed on YouTube and will be recorded. And for everyone's own privacy, video, microphone, and chat features have all been turned off. Next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping items. From a technology troubleshooting standpoint, if you run into any issues at any point in time with this session, just consider doing some of the following. So you can adjust your view options, make sure that you are either full size or minimizing it, and try and see if that sorts things out. You can also visit Get Involved Kingston for a list of resources on our online Zoom platform. They will also apply to this. You can rejoin using the link provided here or call into the meeting at that number there. Double check that with the invite that you have for this, as they may be unique. Then you can also follow along on YouTube if you'd like. Next slide, please. There are 2 main ways to ask questions throughout this session. The project team has a designated question and a separate comment point in time during this presentation. You can ask a question in writing by typing it in the Q&A area, and you'll just see that in your bottom tab there. You just click Q&A and you can either type a question, or alternatively, you can ask a question verbally using the raise hand function. And again, that should just be on your lower bar there. Sometimes it's under reactions, depending on what version of Zoom you have. If you choose to raise your hand, your microphone will be enabled and you'll have an opportunity to go ahead and ask your question or share your comment at that point in time. Once you ask your question or share your comment, you'll then be muted again, and we'll just go down the queue. We ask that you do use the Q&A and the raised hand features, as this allows us to maintain a queue and make sure that we get to as many individuals as possible during the session. If you do raise your hand, just as a note, you will be unmuted. And so as a result, anything you say can be heard by any attendees at the session. Same goes for the chat. If you put anything in the chat, it may be visible to anyone in attendance. And next slide, please. As a reminder, these are our guidelines for participation. They guide all city engagements. This is a consultant-led session, but we do ask that you adhere to these rules. If we've all had a chance to review the guidelines for participation and there are no major concerns at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to the project team to run the open house. Next slide. Thanks very much.
All right, so thanks very much, Mark. My name is Mark Tao. I am a planner with IBI Groups. We are the planning consultants for the applicant of this project, the applicant being Homestead Land Holdings Limited. And so we filed applications for official plan and zoning bylaw amendments earlier this year, and we are now starting to go through the Planning Act review process administered by the City of Kingston. So the outline for the open house is, for the approximate first half, we'll present the proposal. And then for the second half of the evening, it'll be questions and answers, and then a comment section as well. Depending on how many questions there are, we'll try to shift things around as much as we can to allow everyone the opportunity to provide comments or questions. But there's also the opportunity to provide written comments through the city or directly to myself, and then we can provide answers back. All right, so to start off, location, the subject lands are at the terminus of Lower Union Street along the waterfront and accessed by Lower Union Street to Ontario Street. The lands themselves are made up of primarily filled land created by a retaining wall or a shore wall created in the 1800s. It forms part of the dry dock that's next door at 55 Ontario Street. And The site is currently vacant. It has been for many years. Past uses I'll get into a little bit later. Previously industrial shipbuilding uses from decades prior, and the site has been vacant since that time. So as I said, the site was created via filling with a shore wall constructed in the late 1800s, associated with the shipyard and the dry dock. So industrial uses were on the site previously, associated with the shipbuilding on the adjacent dry dock property. The dry dock or limestone dry dock and associated buildings were used as industrial working waterfront between 1890 and the 1960s. The dry dock is recognized as a National Historic Site of Canada, and post the site's use as part of an active waterfront marine industrial site. The site was used for various interim uses, but has largely fallen into disrepair, disuse, since it was no longer being used as an active dry dock or shipbuilding property. The subject property, together with 55 Ontario Street, which is a separate lot, so that's the parcel here that you can see is B, C, D, and E, which is now under the ownership of the Marine Museum. Together, this parcel and the Marine Museum parcel are a designated property under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, primarily because of the dry dock and also the associated, or some of the associated original buildings, particularly the pump house building out closest to the water here. In terms of the site context, the subject site is on the waterfront. There are a number of modern developments along the waterfront and on both sides of Ontario Street, including a number of tall buildings ranging from, or apartment buildings ranging in height from 6 to 18 stories. The Sydenham District, Old Sydenham District HCD is to the east, or sorry, to the west, on the west side of Ontario Street. And so the subject lands are adjacent to, but not in the HCD. Surrounding uses are obviously the dry dock and the pump house, Navy Memorial Park, which abuts Ontario Street and Lower Union Street, a number of apartment buildings ranging from the taller Block D buildings to some of the 6 to 9 story apartment buildings abutting Ontario Street, as well as the 20 Gore Street apartment building and mixed use building, and the 2 Gore Street 2-story residential commercial building. These two photos show the site as viewed from the top photo. The site is viewed from the harbor, the Kingston Yacht Club. So looking north towards downtown, toward Block D, etc. So you can see a number of the existing apartment buildings, as well as 2 Gore Street on the far right. And the subject site is really a pier. You can see just to the right of the Block D buildings. And then the bottom is as viewed from the water. And you can see the variety of buildings along the streetscape, or along the skyline, along the shoreline. In terms of ownership history, the federal government, as noted, is the longest owner in recent history. Up until 2016, they owned it and leased it to the city of Kingston. And the city then, I understand, allowed or had the Marine Museum using predominant part of the parcel, particularly the dry dock and the existing buildings at 55 Ontario. Federal government sold the property in 2016 in 2 pieces, one being 55 Ontario Street, which is the dry dock and the pump house, and then 5 Lower Union Street, which is the subject parcel, the vacant land. In 2017, previous owners submitted applications for a 20-story residential building and for redevelopment of the pump house and the dry dock, so to redevelop both parcels. And then in 2019, those applications were withdrawn. And earlier this year, the new owner filed new applications for the subject property, 5 Lower Union Street. Prior to that, the current owner had acquired the Marine Museum property, and that has now gone into ownership of the Marine Museum and is not part of this development proposal. So the subject applications for the lands are an official plan amendment, which looks at changing the designation of portions of the land to enable the residential development, as well as a zoning bylaw amendment to change the existing harbor zoning to permit an apartment building or permit the proposed residential use. There are a number of development constraints on the property, as well as goals for development. So development constraints, as with a waterfront site, particularly a waterfront site with a pier, there's a cost of restoration of the seawall, which is obviously over 100 years old in many cases. Also remediating the site from the previous industrial uses has resulted in contamination from the shipbuilding and related marine industrial uses. Because of the location next to the water, underground parking is infeasible, which means you have to try to accommodate any parking for any use above grade or at grade. And the access via Lower Union Street is somewhat unusual in that it terminates without any sort of typical cul-de-sac or turnaround that one might expect from a public road. So you have to accommodate things like fire access, etc. And then, of course, finally, just being surrounded by water constraints related to a single access point. In terms of development objectives, it's a large underutilized brownfield site within walking distance of the downtown core. So the premise is to remediate the site, allow it to be redeveloped and used for residential, where it's in a good location to be within walking distance of amenities, services, employment uses, etc. Also to develop it in a way that preserves or conserves the cultural heritage values of the adjacent dry dock and marine museum or pump house buildings. And also to preserve an opportunity for a future deep water dock for Great Lakes cruise ships. And lastly, to provide critical links in the waterfront master plan waterfront pathway in the downtown. So the proposal itself is for a 12-story apartment building on top of a 1-story parking structure, so 13 stories total. The building, particularly the envelope itself, both the tower footprint and the podium footprint and podium envelope are much smaller than what was proposed by the previous owner. The tower structure itself is smaller and lower, both in terms of the footprint and the overall height. And the parking structure podium is only 1 story, whereas the previous proposal had been for approximately 4-story parking structure. There's also a substantial area in front of the building between the building and the water, which provides for a public pathway around the site, as well as for substantial landscaping and green space, and for a turnaround for a potential future deep water port or deep water dock. These are elevation images showing the building itself. So approximately 68 units are proposed with 88 parking spaces to be accommodated primarily within the 1-story parking structure. The density is about 97 dwelling units per net hectare, which qualifies as high density within the OP and the zoning, and a mix of indoor and outdoor amenity spaces to be provided for the residents of the building, private balconies at grade, amenity space, as well as common spaces within the building. This is a view of the building looking from the water inland, so towards the dry dock, which you can see on the right here, as well as the pump house associated with the dry dock and the 20 Gore Street building beyond, and the existing apartment structure here on the left. So you can see here a waterfront pathway that comes around the edge of the pier and then would circle back in to provide opportunity for public access. And this is a view looking out over the dry dock out to the water. This shows the entrance to the building and to the site, as well as to the waterfront area associated with the development. The modeling here shows an aerial view of the proposed building, which can be seen here in its context. So Some taller buildings here in the foreground. It's a mix of 6 to 9 story, 5 to 9 story apartment structures in the area and the context. And then access to the site coming off of Ontario Street down Lower Union Street, which ends at the existing parking lot. And this shows a massing view from an aerial view from the water, again looking northwest and towards the downtown to the right. And a view looking northeast. And then 2 views from the water, or sorry, the top view being from the water from the approximate path of the Wolfe Island Ferry Terminal, looking towards the site with the proposed building shown on the water. And then the bottom image is a view from the Kingston Yacht Club, looking north towards the downtown, towards Block D and the other developments along the waterfront. And this is a view down Lower Union Street, so from within the HCD. So one of the policies in the official plan, as well as policies within the HCD plan, speak to preservation of views down roads leading to the water or terminate at Lake Ontario. So within the 20-meter right-of-way of the streets, the view is to be preserved. And so this image shows that that view is still maintained. I spoke earlier about the termination of Lower Union Street. So Lower Union Street at this point really just ends at a dead end, more or less. There's no opportunity for turnaround, et cetera, for the public or for public utilities operations. So part of the development needs is to accommodate how a proper terminus may be given to Lower Union Street so that there is a proper opportunity for turnaround. The Deepwater Dock that is being contemplated, the option for a Deepwater Dock, I should say, is being preserved on the site. And that ties to the city's strategic plan to facilitate a cruise ship dock in the downtown as a tourism opportunity for the city. And so the site has been designed to accommodate the option for that in the future, should the city choose to pursue that. The waterfront master plan identifies connections that are still needed to accommodate the waterfront trail and the waterfront pathway. So the waterfront pathway currently crosses the site through the form of an easement just along here. So at the east side of these parking spaces that serve the existing parking lot. And then someone who was walking would circle back up and walk by up onto Ontario Street into Neighbour Memorial Park and continue on. The site's redevelopment would allow for the pathway to be built out as per the waterfront master plan, which speaks to having a walkway that goes out around the edge of the pier and then back inland again, following the path of the shoreline. So this is an excerpt from the waterfront master plan to showing the intended or possible routes for the waterfront master plan. Also contemplates opportunities for access across the dry dock, and something that's out of the scope of this project, but could be provided given that the access does go out around the pier. In terms of the contamination of the subject lands, it is a brownfield in that the previous industrial uses of the property have resulted in contamination of the soils and the fill within the seawall. The seawall itself, as it is very old, is also deteriorated, and so the development of the lands would allow for the seawall to be restored and the brownfield or the contamination to be cleaned up or remediated so that it could be preserved or the site could be redeveloped. So a number of technical studies were included with the planning applications, and these are all available on Dash through the city's website, through the city's online portal, so they can be provided or accessed and downloaded through that, where we can also provide it to anybody who's seeking more information. So in terms of natural heritage, because it's a waterfront site, an environmental impact assessment was conducted just to assess what the existing habitat may be. And because of the industrial nature of the site, or previous industrial nature of the site, the primary single natural heritage feature of note was the fish habitat associated with Lake Ontario. And no in-water works are proposed other than to restore the existing seawall and design it in such a way that it's able to meet a minimum design life expectancy. And so if the project's approved, it would have to go through a consultation and approval process with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to look at how the site reconstruction of the site seawall would be reconstructed and installed. With respect to heritage, because it is part of a designated heritage property and associated with the dry dock and the associated pump house, an HIS was prepared by ERA, and it will be going through a peer review process, as is the city's standard practice. So that HIS and the peer review assesses whether or not the proposed development conserves the heritage resources on and adjacent to the property, and it guides how the site should be developed, including the design of the building. And then with respect to natural hazards, so this looks at things like flooding and erosion. The sites, as are all the sites along the waterfront in the downtown, because it's based on filled land with man-made shore walls, the site has to be designed to accommodate and to maintain its integrity over time, withstanding flooding, erosion, wave, wind, etc. And so a natural hazards assessment was undertaken, assessing the site and how a new seawall could be designed to ensure that the site can be appropriately developed and avoid creating new hazards or avoid creating a condition where flooding, for example, would render the site inaccessible. And so that process is integrated into the design of the site. And those elements are going to be reviewed by both the Conservation Authority as well as by a third-party peer reviewer coordinated by the City of Kingston. And so next steps, as I said, the applications were filed earlier this year, and city staff and commenting agencies such as the Conservation Authority are reviewing the applications. Peer reviews of the heritage, urban design, and natural hazard studies are all being conducted or will commence shortly. We anticipate that the statutory public meeting will take place in the summer of 2021. And then based on that feedback, as well as public comments, agency comments, peer review comments, revised proposal can come forward to address those comments received. And then after that, there's also a Heritage Act approval process, a Conservation Authority permitting process because it is a waterfront property, and then a council decision on the planning applications. So I'll now open up to questions. So we have about 35, 40 minutes. So I will try to answer as many questions as I can during that time, as well as provide opportunities for public comment. And also, just so you're aware, city staff, including planning department representatives, are here at the meeting as well, and so they are available to, or they'll hear questions. They aren't available to answer questions except of a technical process nature, but they are available certainly to receive questions and comments in writing, and I'll provide their email address as well as my email address at the end of the presentation if you have anything that's any additional questions you may have that we haven't gotten to. And so in terms of answering questions, I have 8 questions that have been provided in writing. If there's questions that you'd like to voice verbally, I can unmute you. You can, if you want to use the raise hand function, we can do that as well. So I don't see anybody with a raised hand, so I will go through the written comments for now that are in the Q&A box. And if somebody wants to speak a comment or voice a question verbally, then please use your raised hand and I will get to those as well. But I'll start with the written comments and questions. So the first question I have asks that the previous design study commissioned by the city recommended buildings being no higher than 8 to 13 stories. Please explain the rationale behind the 14-story proposal. And yeah, so I think there is some discrepancies in some of the documents that were submitted. So the one, for example, on the screen indicates proposed 14-story apartment building when it's a 1-story parking podium with a 12-story tower on top. And there's a partial 14th floor, I guess, but it's really a mechanical floor with some amenity space. So it's set back from the edge of the building. So it's kind of a 13 plus a partial 14th floor. And that's based on support from the Heritage Impact Study and the Urban Design Study that felt that the 14 stories, particularly with a much smaller tower floor plate, was appropriate on the site. So when designing the proposal, Homestead and the consultant team and the architect used the previous peer review, the previous study that the city had done for the previous proposal, used the recommendations from that peer reviewer to help guide what was done in terms of reducing the tower height, reducing the tower size, reducing the parking amounts, reducing the parking podium, etc. So that helped to guide what was submitted. And so we will now go through that review process with a peer reviewer to reassess the new submission or the submission from the new owner. Second question is, does Homestead plan on reclaiming lost land due to erosion? And if so, what are legalities, et cetera, in terms of, looks like municipal kind of approvals, what might be needed. And so I don't think I have a good image in the slide. So over time, before Homestead purchased the property, the shore wall, particularly along the southwest, so I would say this area here, and if anybody has seen the site, you'll certainly see that erosion has happened. So the intention is to restore the original shore wall edge, and there still is, old cribbing, old structural components of the original shore wall below the surface of the water, so below grade. And so the intention is to restore the original shore wall boundary as it was. And so because it's within the property boundary, there isn't a need for additional permitting beyond the Conservation Authority permitting process. But if there needs to be kind of rock wall or riprap additions to help with the design strength, as you would see elsewhere along the shoreline where there's the kind of the rocky shoreline, then that would require Department of Fisheries and Oceans approval potentially for that type of work. So that would be a future approval to be assessed as part of that. The next question is with respect to asking for brownfields or financial assistance or relief. So the property is outside of the city's community improvement plan area or CIP, and properties that are within a CIP are eligible for brownfields funding, et cetera, tax rebates if they clean up a site, for example. The intention here is to clean up the site, to restore the seawall, et cetera. And so the intention, I believe, is to apply for brownfields funding to help assist with that, consistent with other brownfield sites within the city. The site was excluded from the CIP originally because when the CIP was written, the community improvement plan was written, the property was owned by the federal government, and the city excluded federal government owned properties. So now that it's not owned by the federal government, the owners are intending to apply for inclusion within the CIP. Not that that automatically means that funding will be given. There's still an approval process to go through as part of that, and a separate application that has to be filed. Next question, what's the proposed method of remediation in terms of or containment? So that is a good question. I do not have the answer to that myself. Our specifics, my understanding is that There will be some removal of contaminated soils, and sometimes also if there's soils that are not too heavily contaminated, under certain circumstances, they can be retained on site, but that would have to go through its own approval process in terms of Ministry of the Environment approval. So why does the building have to be 12 stories high? It seems this may impede many people who live in the area. I'm assuming in terms of impeding people's views. Oh, yes, that's the clarification below. And already rent from homestead. So I think the balance of height of the building versus the kind of the size of the building in terms of the length and the width, it's always a bit of a balancing act in terms of getting a minimum number of units, in this case 68 units, to make the project viable. So it's really a balancing of not making what's not too tall, or getting something isn't too tall, without making the footprint too big, etc. So I think it's a balancing of that. Even if even if the tower were 6 stories, for example, the next story building at 33 Ontario Street, which is only, I believe, 5 to 6 stories, even reducing the height significantly, I think we'd still be looking at blocking views that were previously there. So I think it's really been a balancing of trying to find a footprint and a size of development that works, and tries to balance the many issues and demands on the site. The next question is about public access route from Lower Union Street being sufficient for emergency service access. And so yes, that's one of the challenges of the site, because Lower Union Street currently just essentially dead ends. The site has to be designed to accommodate a fire route, and that's just a requirement of the Ontario Building Code. And so the intention is that the site, whether there's an expansion kind of to create a roundabout, or that the fire route as it's proposed right now would come onto the property, as is typical with a private apartment development. The fire route is typically on the private property, because you have to drive around portions of the building. So currently the fire route would come out alongside the north side of the building, and then the fire trucks could turn around at the cul-de-sac here at the end, and that would be the code approved fire route for a site like this. And certainly, some sites are able to have multiple access points. In this case, Lower Union Street is the only way in and out. And so there are standards though for minimum distances from roads, etc. And so the site will have to meet those, which we believe it does. The fire department would review those as part of their review of the project. One of the questions is, when did this become a brownfield site? When it was owned by Mr. Patry, it was now a brownfield site. Why was it changed? So I guess the definition of a brownfield site is more of a generic one, in terms of a contaminated site is considered a brownfield site. And so this site has been contaminated for many, many years, related to its previous marine industrial use associated with the dry dock and all the shipbuilding. So it's been a brownfield site for a long time. I think the question may more be, is it related to the eligibility for tax funding for cleanup? And so that's something that the owner can apply for to the city through that separate process to amend the CIP. So I spoke to that earlier. I'll try to not spend too much time on that. Next question is, let's see here. What provisions been made to accommodate the cruise terminal? And so from Homestead's perspective, the cruise terminal isn't part of their development per se. It's not part of their operations, but the city has expressed an interest in preserving the option that this could be a deep water port for cruise ships. And so what that means on this site is to accommodate, for example, the turnaround at the end for tour buses, as well as to provide, I guess, a structural basis along the pier wall. So the pier wall is designed to be able to accommodate a cruise ship to moor right off the end of the pier. So that's really what it means at this point in simplistic terms, is that there's access for a bus or tour buses, and that also that the pier dock is structurally able to accommodate cruise ship tie-up. So the so-called waterfront pathway is less than 3 meters in most places, despite the fact that the city's waterfront master plan and zoning calls for 10-meter setbacks. Why have you not provided the required setback? Yeah, so I think on a site like this and where the waterfront trail is concerned, there's just the reality of trying to accommodate many different things within the site. And so we're working with the city, or we're expecting comments from the city in terms of from the Parks Department, what they would expect to see on a waterfront trail on the site in terms of the minimum width of the pathway, as well as minimum setbacks from the water, et cetera. And so I think it's just, again, trying to balance a building envelope, trying to balance setbacks required for a pathway, for conservation authority purposes, et cetera. And so that's something that we're certainly expecting we're going to work through as part of the review process. And the next question, how wide is the waterfront pathway? So it tends to vary, and it's conceptual at this point. So I think it really depends on the setback of the building from the edge, as well as the opportunities required, or the ability to have turnarounds for driving aisles. So the minimum width really is, I think, 3 meters, but there are areas where it'd be wider, and hopefully no less than that throughout its length in this part of the site. So in light of recent compromise in the Capital Theatre project, Homestead be prepared to meet directly with and incorporate feedback from relevant stakeholders such as residents association and community groups. So I think this is part of the process that we're in right now. Currently, we filed the applications, and we're looking, or starting the public consultation process through this open house, through a future statutory public meeting. So happy to receive comments and interest in meetings from any who may be wanting to talk and provide their views on the project. So will the finished elevation of the pathway be raised to avoid any wave uprush? Yes, so through the technical process, particularly the natural hazards report that was completed, it looked at wave uprush, particularly waves driven by wind, for example, because the southwest face here and where the waterfront trail would go. And so it looks at, is there a need for a knee wall or like a partial barrier or other things that would protect the site? So that's something that has been assessed, and the site has been designed to avoid wave overtopping onto the public pathway. And that's part of the Conservation Authority review process, as well as the natural hazards peer review process that the city is administering as well. The next question is, was there any consideration of including the adjacent parking lot for 33 Ontario within the parking podium with a green ramp to publicly accessible green space on top as part of the waterfront trail? Yes, I think the answer is that there's been multiple iterations, I guess, considered leading up to what was finally submitted, and looking at what other options there may have been for laying out the site, for maximizing setbacks and parking, et cetera. And so I think the Homestead did consider various options and looking at how to provide good public access, how to maximize parking, et cetera. And so part of that was trying to minimize the amount of parking structure on the site, and not to compromise views unnecessarily for adjacent properties. So I think that's certainly something that was looked at and something that helped inform the current design. So as climate crisis gets worse, wind, waves, and flooding will increase. Do your plans take this into consideration? So as part of the natural hazards reports, and as part of the Conservation Authority review, as part of the PPS, the provincial policy statement, there is a requirement to consider the impacts of a changing climate, and that can include both higher water levels and lower water levels. And so that's something that was assessed as part of the natural hazards review, and something that we expect will be part of the review process with the Conservation Authority as part of their comments as well. Next comment, I think, is a follow-up. The tenant parking along the roundabout, will there be sufficient room for emergency vehicles? And there seems to be no access on the south side for emergency vehicles. So yes, the roundabout's designed such that it's a proper fire route in terms of turning radiuses and widths, a 6-meter width. And any parking that would be along the side of it would be outside of that fire route. So similar to a public road where you'd have the lane, the driving lane, and then a parallel parking space along the side. That's how it's designed so that it could accommodate emergency vehicles. In terms of emergency vehicle access on the southwest side, so along this part here where the setback is reduced, the fire department access, you don't have to have a full fire around all sides of the building, only need for access for within certain distances. So the building has been designed and the site laid out so that it does meet those distances for fire access. So it does have the opportunity to access it on 3 sides where needed, and that meets the code requirements in terms of fire department access. So the next question is with respect to proposal accommodating required water body setbacks applied to current personal homes. And so, yeah, it's a good question. And certainly you would see a lot of waterfront sites, particularly rural waterfront sites or suburban waterfront sites, much greater setbacks, say 30 meters is a common one, and that's ribbon of life policies in the official plan speak to a 30-meter ribbon of life. However, the policies as they are in the OP do contemplate reduced setbacks, particularly in the urban areas of the city and the downtown. And so because of that and the nature of the urban, or the fact that it's an urban site, that's where a reduced setback may be appropriate, considering it's supported by, or if it's supported by the Conservation Authority and by other technical studies, that there wouldn't be any impacts on natural heritage, which is the primary concern in the proposed or intended to be dealt with by having a 30-meter setback, is really protection of what's the adjacent natural heritage feature, whether it's a wetland or water body, et cetera. And so because of the nature of the site, the reduced setback is proposed because there aren't anticipated to be any negative impacts on the water body due to that reduced setback. Just a question about email address for questions. So yes, I will pop that up at the end. I'll pop that up right now just so people have a chance to write it down for a minute, and then I can flip back. Next question, I'm just keeping an eye on time, 17 minutes or so. So looks like around 1/2 of the green color on the site plan is private amenities for residents. Yes, so really the green you would see on the site here is actually the top of the parking structure. So it would be an outdoor amenity space for residents of the building. There's no proposed public park land as part of this site, other than the waterfront trail connection. And depending on the nature of parks comments, et cetera, there may be an opportunity for some, widened public realm here at the end, so for viewing platforms, et cetera. So I think that's something that we're anticipating would come out as part of the public comment, or the municipality's comments. Question, why not reduce the private space to improve the access for visitors? I think, yeah, this speaks to kind of the balancing of the many different needs and requirements for the site in terms of providing quality public access through the waterfront trail, as well as providing access to the end of the pier for a potential waterfront or a deep water port. And so I think it's kind of balancing and squeezing all these things together and trying to find an end product that meets the needs of the site. We could squeeze the parking podium down if it were to be 2 stories and fit all the parking in 2 stories instead of 1, but then that increases kind of the building massing on the site, which we're trying to avoid as well. Next question is, the design factored impacts of intense winds as a natural hazard on the safety of the building and the surrounding buildings. So yes, so there is a wind study that was conducted that looked at pedestrian safety and comfort, for example, walking around the edge of the pier. And so that did look at the impact of wind on the site and the usability of it. Next question is the Marine Museum being asked to contribute to the cost of its relocated, rebuilt parking spaces, or is that paid for by the developer? So I think that's in relation to the area up here on Lower Union Street. And there isn't really, this is kind of an unrefined area of the plan, I guess I'll put it that way. For anybody who knows the site, this area really here next to the dry dock is a kind of a big gravel parking area. And so I think that's something that's to be determined in conjunction with how the city envisions Lower Union Street being designed, because really that's part of the public realm here. So I think the Marine Museum needs to look at how much parking they require, and then work together with the city and Homestead about what that area next to Lower Union Street may look like in terms of parking, public access, etc. Next question is that the shadow shown on one of the illustration looks to be an underrepresentation of the impact of the blocking of views and wind. Don't know if I had a shadow image in here. There was a shadow study done, and maybe it's referring to that. So there's a shadow study that was done that looks at spring, summer, fall, winter shadowing, and the shadow that's cast by the building. And so in terms of blocking of views, it wouldn't show the blocking of views, it would show shadowing. I don't really have one that shows probably the view from any specific building, but I can, that might be a good question to follow up with on that. Was there any consideration of reducing parking to one spot per unit or less given the city's active transportation plans? I think the developer, because of the sites and because of need to accommodate potential visitor parking, etc., Homestead was cautious about undersupplying parking on the site to the detriment of what impact it might have if there's more needed or visitors need parking, that they end up parking on side streets within Sydenham District. And so they wanted to ensure that they had a sufficient parking supply on site to avoid off-site visitor parking impacts. And I think just based on their experience, about 1.2 to 1.3 spaces per unit is what they anticipate tenants would be looking for. And so that's the primary reason why they're providing this parking, because they believe that they will need it, and that between visitors and tenants that they would need that amount of parking supply. Next question, I do recognize there's somebody who has their hand up, so maybe there's two more written questions here, so I'll answer those two, and then I'll go to Mr. McDonald, who has his hand raised, and I'll unmute him, and he can ask his question as well. So the next question is, the parking garage at grade, or can it be set down 50% or more? And then walking next to the parking garage is not fun, fumes, noise. Will the south side have possible green technologies to improve the situation? Yeah, that's one of the challenges with the site is to accommodate parking. Surface parking is not a good idea. It doesn't look good, particularly on a waterfront, high visibility site. Underground parking would be ideal, and there is, nearby at Block D, for example, there is some underground parking for one level, partially raised. And so I think Homestead looked at, and they have that experience on the water about what they can do below grade versus at grade or above grade. And so I think the answer is that at grade with the one-story structure was found to be the best option from a feasibility perspective. But as the commenter noted, it does come with challenges in terms of, not really necessarily a pleasant environment for pedestrians. And so that's part of what the urban design study looked at in terms of how to design a parking structure so that it can look attractive and not be like some of the other developments further up the waterfront pathway closer to downtown, where it's not a very inviting space. It is noisy, etc. And so I think this is beneficial in that it's only a 1-story structure versus a previous proposal that had 3 or 4 stories next to the pathway. And you can see in the rendering here, there's things that can be done in terms of living walls, plantings, etc., to help screen a parking so that it's not doesn't look like a parking structure, and that it maybe adds to the experience rather than detracts from it. And that's certainly something that was one of the key elements of the urban design study, was to look how to deal with the pedestrian realm next to the parking structure, and something that we expect the peer reviewer, the Heritage and Urban Design Study, will look at as well. Okay, last written question I have up is, how deep will Homestead have to go before it reaches solid ground that will support a tower of this size? I'm not a geotech or structural expert, but my understanding of this is that when building on the pier, on this one or others similar to it, it's not the same case as building on suburban site where you've got a certain amount of soil on top of bedrock, particularly in Kingston, and that you're just gonna dig the soil out, build a foundation on bedrock, or have footings and go from there. So in cases like this, where it's a lot of filled land, the typical way it's approached is actually using piles that go down to bedrock, and so that the structural integrity of the tower and the building isn't dependent on the fill. It's actually anchored to the bedrock below the fill, even when it comes to kind of a filled site like this in water. So long story short is it's a unique site, and so that it will be dependent on using those types of structural pilings to accommodate a building that would go into that. And that's part of the natural hazards report that was conducted as well. And the geotechnical report looked at the site conditions and how the building could be constructed because of the fill on the site. So, okay, another question has popped up, but I think looks like the raised hand is down. But if somebody still had a question they wanted to verbalize, happy to have that. But in the meantime, there is another question. Is there anything preventing moving the tower west? Let me go here. So moving west, meaning inland, I believe. And so I think, again, this is one of those balancing questions in terms of keeping some separation to the apartment building to the west. But I think from a design perspective, the answer was that this is felt to be the best location. But from a technical perspective, there's nothing really that would prevent it from moving around a bit on the parking podium. I think, again, it was about balancing shadow impacts. The closer you are to the apartment building to the west, the more shadow you would cast on it. And also just keeping it away from the dry dock, potentially. The closer inland you go, shadow impacts on that as well. So again, it's all about balancing, but we do expect that through the peer review process and the city's technical review process, there will be comments on the building design, placement, etc. And so it certainly isn't necessarily the final word in terms of what the building placement will look like on the site or the design details, etc. So. All right, so those are all the written questions I have. And I don't see anybody with a hand up. I'll just bring up the last slide again with the email contact info for both myself, Mark Tao, as well as for the City of Kingston planner on the file, which is Janice Grant. And so feel free to contact either myself or Janice. All the technical reports, etc., are available on the city's Dash portal. But if you need something emailed to you that you don't see, or if you have an outstanding question, by all means, feel free to email either Janice or myself. I have another question that came in here. So there's not seem to be any green area or buffer from the walkway on the south side. Are there any safety measures in place? Let's see here. So south side being between the building and the water, I assume. So I'm just gonna see if I have a better image here. The walkway itself, yeah, I'll use this one, I guess. So the walkway itself would be in the location between the building and the shore wall. The shore wall itself would have likely a short knee wall, which is like a solid kind of knee wall, maybe a foot or 18 inches. Part of that would be for kind of wave protection for the waterfront trail, and then a railing, of course, on top of that. Potentially, not all the waterfront areas have railings next to them, so that would be a question of, I think, from the public or the city's perspective, is there a need from a public safety perspective to have railings, et cetera? But then in terms of having landscaped area between the trail and the building, that's where I think this image shows, an idea of what that could look like in terms of having a unique design of the building facade. There's living walls, if you've seen those, or other types of vegetative treatments along next to buildings and compact areas that could help to green that space up and make it more inviting. I think it also helps, again, that it's only a single-story building that's open to the sky. Previous iteration was a much taller parking podium, which would seem more imposing. There's other conditions along the stretch of the water that are partly covered, which is also not great. But I think this is, there's important to get this part right to make it accommodating and make it attractive to people to use and want to be there, and not just kind of bypass that part of the pier and continue on. So I think that will be an important part of the design details going forward. Okay, another question coming in. So how long would it take to build this tower? I'm talking about disruptions with the construction due to noise, dirt, etc. I don't have a good answer to that one. Typical suburban apartment build is probably 18 months. I think this would really be a multi-phase process because of the shore wall restoration that would happen. So it would probably be broken up over a couple of seasons, and certainly Homestead having a building right next door and also developing the site, they certainly have a lot of tenants who I'm sure they would want to keep happy in terms of not disrupting their experience right next door. So I'm sure they will do what they can to minimize disruptions to the neighborhood, to neighbors, to the public in general as part of that. Another question that's come through, please explain how this pier might accommodate a cruise boat and where. So you go to the last one, will be the best image for this. So the intention is, or the site, again, not wanting to kind of overstate this, but the city has expressed an interest in having a deep water port in the downtown. And it's by no means a given that it's going to be on this site. I think what Homestead's intention was to preserve the opportunity for it to be here based on the city goal to accommodate that downtown, and that there are limited opportunities to do that. And so what Homestead's done at a conceptual level is to provide a concept plan of how that could work on this site. Has positioned the building on the west side of the site to provide the opportunity for a mooring along the shore wall here. And maybe I'll just use I'll use this one here, it's probably better. And so the cruise ship would moor off the end of the pier here, potentially having to have what's called a dolphin, which is like an extra, like a floating tie-up or another structural tie-up, but primarily would anchor off the end of the pier, and then public access would come, or boat, the cruise ship occupants would come off, board tour buses or walk more likely, hopefully, to the downtown from this location. And so that would have to, take into account proper access for the building, not interfere with that, as well as to allow not interfere with public access to other areas. So follow-up question there was, would the cruise buses not interfere with emergency access for the fire department, et cetera? And yes, that's certainly a consideration. And so I think that would have to be something that will be looked at as part of the design of the site, and whether tour buses would necessarily come into the site, or because of the proximity of the site to the downtown, would they not use tour buses at all, and it would simply be pedestrians disembarking from the cruise ship and walking inland. But there's really not a lot of detail available at this point. It was really just providing the opportunity for cruise ship to dock and for cruise ship users to disembark. Nothing more than that. And I think if there is an interest from the city to explore that further, Homestead's made the site able to accommodate that. But I think it would be subject to a lot more further discussion and design details about what that would actually look like in practice. So, yeah. All right, so we're at the 7 o'clock mark, and I believe all the questions I have been answered. I provided an answer to them. I understand if you have more questions or comments and follow up, again, please don't hesitate to contact myself or Janice at the city. There will be another statutory public meeting under the Planning Act that would come up, we anticipate, sometime in the summer. And of course, you can provide comments through Dash as well, through the file contact there. And yeah, so if there's anything else, I see in the chat, I'm not sure if there's any other questions there. No, okay. All right, so I think that's it for everybody. So thank you very much for your time and for coming out and your interest. And the conversation will continue as we move through the process going forward. So thanks very much.